Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing you guys my top 10 city building games. These are all board games that have some element or component of city building. Actually building a city building by building. And quite often these are literal cities. Sometimes they're fictitious, but it's very important, as far as my list is concerned, that the city building be actually something that has long or permanent effects throughout the game, not some abstract representation of you putting something that represents a building and therefore it has no other impact later on in the game. Those buildings that you are edifying, that you're constructing, that you're erecting, those buildings actually have tangible benefits for the player or players going forward in the game. So without any further ado, let's move on straight to my number 10. My number 10 city building game is Puerto Rico by Andreas Seyfarth, the classic game here. This game was ranked number 1 on BGG for many years and still ranks very highly and is considered a classic in the genre in every sense of the word. And this game here, basically players are having a player board which represents their island of Puerto Rico, but they also have this section here that's referred to as San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico. And San Juan, the building of San Juan here, is just as crucial as anything else you do on the island, perhaps even more so. Because as the game progresses, you're going to be taking lots of actions, you're going to be trying to ship goods and collect money and all that stuff. And you're doing the role selection, which is really cool and really neat and innovative. But when you're building the buildings, you're placing them in these slots here in Puerto Rico. And there's 12 spots for buildings. So you could build 12 regular sized buildings, or perhaps you could build fewer by building these larger buildings that actually occupy 2 of those 2 slots. So there's a couple of really valuable big buildings that you could purchase throughout the game that give you even more benefits than the smaller buildings. And all of these buildings do something different for you. They either make you more efficient in your productivity, in your production of the different goods, or they gain you different coins in different ways, or they allow you to ship goods or gain victory points in diverse manners. Again, all these buildings do some really, really cool, neat things. And if you add the building expansion to Puerto Rico, then you got tons of different buildings that are going to help you in so many ways, and trying to map out your strategy so that all your buildings not only give you victory points, because each of these buildings do contribute to your victory point total at the end of the game, but also try to strategize so that the buildings complement one another, so that they combo well with one another. That is the challenge of the game. And that's the cool thing about the buildings expansion. By adding more buildings and randomly deciding which 20 buildings or so are going to be available for the game, players don't need to fall into a rut of doing the same strategy over and over again. And again, it makes you approach each game as a new and fresh experience, making the game highly modular. My number 10 city building game of all time, Puerto Rico. And now we move on to my number 9. And my number 9 is Wisdom of Solomon, designed by Philip Dubarry and published by Fun Hill Games. And this is a Bible-themed game, and therefore it comes from a small publisher. The production quality is not the greatest, and the graphic design is lackluster, to say the least. However, the gameplay is phenomenal. This game is beautiful, first of all, from a gameplay perspective. The board is not too bad looking. I personally don't mind it, but basically it consists of an abstracted side of Jerusalem here, plus the map of Israel running along the right side of the board. And there's a bunch of different worker placement actions that you could take. This is a worker placement game in its essence. But throughout the game, one of the many actions you're doing is, first of all, you're helping contribute towards the building of the temple, the center of Jerusalem, basically. You're building it one step at a time, and that's actually the end game condition. Once the temple is completely built, represented by the removal of all the tiles there, then the game is over and whoever has the most points wins. But you're also going to the quarry here, and you're using your resources in order to build other buildings along the way that will contribute to Jerusalem, and in particular, they'll be helpful to the player who purchased or contributed the resources towards his building. Because each of these buildings are either going to grant you a permanent special ability for the rest of the game, or they're going to grant you a special worker placement action, a unique worker placement action, different from all the others along the board, that's only available to you as your player. No other players around the table can activate those actions, and I think that's really cool. Another neat thing about this game is the solo mode. It comes with a really cool automa player that they refer to as Jeroboam, and you're drawing these action tiles, these tiles that represent all the different worker placements spots along the board. You're drawing them blindly from a bag, and there's a certain system to it to keep the game balanced and feeling interesting at a solo game. Really cool. My number 9 city building game of all time, Wisdom of Solomon. Now we move on to my number 8, and my number 8 city building game of all time is San Juan, also designed by Andres Seyfarth, and this is the sequel of sorts, the child of Puerto Rico. Same designer and same idea, except this time the name is titled after the city of San Juan, and we're basically focusing only on the city building element. All that other stuff is gone. And you get all of these cards here, and it's basically very similar to Race for the Galaxy. If people are familiar with Race for the Galaxy, they were kind of in pre-production around the same time, and it has a really cool idea because it's a multi-use or multi-purpose card game. Each of the cards can be used in different ways. The cards can either represent the actual buildings that you're trying to construct, and there's a price for each of these buildings on the upper left-hand corner. There's a victory point value on the bottom, and quite often there's an additional benefit that they give you. However, you can use the cards as your money itself, because any discarded card is equal 1 money, and you could use it to pay for other cards in your hand in order to build them onto your tableau. And finally, the cards can be used face down randomly to represent a good according to the production building that produces that good. Really cool, really neat. The city building aspect is fun. First player to trigger 12 buildings will trigger at the end of the game, and whoever has the most victory points at the end of the game is your winner. My number 8 city building game of all time, San Juan. And now we move on to my number 7, and my number 7 is Deadwood, designed by Loic Lamy, and here published by Dust Games and distributed by Fantasy Flight. And this is a Wild West themed game based in Deadwood, and people are working here to build all these different buildings in Deadwood. And basically Deadwood starts with a few buildings, but as the game progresses and players trigger different actions, we'll be adding more buildings. And each of those buildings represents a worker placement spot. So early on in the game, there's not too many worker placement spots, but with each round, there's going to be more and more and more. And these worker placement spots, they give you money, which is basically your victory points at the end of the game. They give you other benefits. They allow you to recruit more cowboys into your ranch. Therefore, you can take more actions in the future. They allow you to repeat actions if you took them already. They allow you to gain strength or ammunition tokens, so you can increase your chances in ammo, because this is a Wild West themed game. Therefore, the worker placement isn't clean. You go to a spot and you're in jeopardy that someone else who covets that same spot can place their worker there and therefore trigger a duel. And then depending on your duel or your combat strengths for each of your workers and certain other factors, your ammunition tokens, you'll roll dice and resolve the conflict, and your characters, if they lose, can be will be killed permanently. They will be removed from the game, and those are workers that you're never going to have again in the game. But one of the coolest things about this game, besides the city building and the fact that you add additional buildings that add additional actions to all the players around the table, one of the cool things about this game is that there's 3 different winning conditions, three different end game conditions, I should say. First of all, you have the fact that if one player runs out of all of their cowboys, they're all killed in combat, in dueling, that will trigger the end of the game for everybody, not just that player. There's no player elimination here. Second of all, if the wanted posters, there's a certain amount of wanted posters in the pool according to the player count. If the wanted posters run out, that also triggers the end of the game. And the wanted posters are given to a player every time a player initiates a duel. They get a wanted poster. Now, there are ways to alleviate that, to remove those. You can go to the town hall or to the church, and these are ways to get rid of your wanted posters, because wanted posters in this game are not a good thing. Exponentially, they're going to make you lose more and more points at the end of the game for each wanted poster that you have still in your possession. So those are 2 of the different ways. You have running a player running out of all their workers, or all their workers dying. You have the wanted posters running out, and finally you have the train station. The train station is built step by step. You're going to be building the train station. First, you're going to build 4 different railroads, which are possibly going to run over different buildings, destroying them and removing them, eliminating them as a spot for the rest of the game. And ultimately, the 5th time you trigger the town hall building, you're going to build a train station, and that will trigger the end of the game, and whoever has the most points is your winner. Really cool. The city building's neat. The multiple different paths of end game conditions, really cool. My number 7 board game, city building board game, Deadwood. My number 4 city building game of all time is Rise to Nobility. And this game here is a worker placement game, dice placement game, where you roll dice and your dice are your workers. But it's so cool because the board consists of a map of the 5 realms, or whatever this fantasy land is referred to here. And basically each of the different sections here, each of the different worker placement spots are affected in different ways. You need different types of dice in order to go there. Sometimes you need a particular number. Sometimes you need to place a particular number if you're the first player, but everybody who goes after you and goes to that same spot is going to have to spend a number that's on their die that's either lower or higher, depending on where they're going on the board. And sometimes you just straight up block other opponents from your spot, as a typical worker placement game would do. But this game is so cool because basically you start with just a few buildings available to all the players in the guilds. You have lots of different worker placement actions, but then you have these different guilds. There's 6 different guilds. You got wizards and elves and what have you. And all these 6 different guilds start the game with just one building available as a worker placement spot. But each guild has 3 slots, potential slots available for players to add additional buildings to, which will therefore add additional worker placement spots. So as the game progresses, you're trying to add these buildings to the different guild sections, depending on which guilds you already have apprentices on. Because if you have an apprentice on a guild, that apprentice could turn into a guild master once you build one of those buildings. And therefore, every time somebody uses that building of yours, you're going to be rewarded. You're going to get a benefit depending on what that worker placement spot says on the board, what's printed on the board. It could be money, it could be resources, and all these things are very, very useful. Along the way, you're trying to recruit different people cards that represent different fantastical races, and you're trying to create space for them in your section of the city. You're trying to create housing for them. Therefore, you're going to welcome them. They're going to want to come and work for you. And these same people groups are going to give you victory points. They're going to give you prestige points. And they're also going to give you, or I should say honor points. They're also going to give you little meeples that represent the pieces that you have to place down in order to get these apprentices. So you're trying to balance all these things. You want to get the people. You want to have the accommodations for the people, because you cannot get the people until you have the accommodations. You want to get the resources, which represent different aspects of culture that perhaps those races, those fantastical races, will be attracted to when you try to lure them into your part of town. All these things you're trying to factor in and ultimately have the most victory points after 10 rounds. Really cool. Lots of options as far as all the different worker placement spots. And again, the options expand as the city building progresses, as players play down these buildings. My number 6 city building game of all time, Rise to Nobility. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop. And I really mean it this time, guys. I absolutely love the top 5 games on this list. As a matter of fact, I could say that number 5 could easily be number 1 if you ask me in a few days, or maybe the next time I play it. But for now, this is the current ranking. My number 5 city building game of all time is Lahav, designed by Uwe Rosenberg. And I know this would be my wife Lily's number 1 city building game, because this is probably her number 1 game, period. But Lahav is really cool because it's a worker placement game, but in essence, there's only one worker. However, the typical tropes of worker placement are in play, because you need to you block an opponent completely once you place your worker on a building. And what's neat about Lahav is you do not remove your worker at the end of the round and put him back in your pool. You keep him in that building, and it actually forces you the next time you take a worker placement action, because there's other things you could do around the worker placement on your turn instead of the worker placement. But if you choose to do worker placement, you're going to have to move that worker, your one and only worker, to a new building. So you can never trigger the same building 2 times in a row. So that's something to factor in and map out as you're making your decisions. But just like in regular typical city building games, you start the game with not too many options. You have a few generic buildings, starting buildings that are in the neutral part of the city that are available to all players, usually at a price. But as the game progresses, you're accruing all these different resources, and you're accruing all this money, and you're either purchasing buildings outright, or you're accruing the resources necessary to build them from scratch. And then you grab the cards that represent these buildings, you place them in your player area, and now that's your little section of Lahav. And those are buildings that you can trigger actions on, but your opponents, if they really want to and need those actions, can also trigger those spots. However, because you own those buildings, they're going to have to pay you a price for every time they choose to use an action, and vice versa. And as the game progresses, each player is having more and more of these buildings in their player areas, in their tableaus. You're having more buildings added to the neutral part of Lahav, so that part of Lahav is growing as well. And all of a sudden, the options are infinite. You have a plethora of choices to make because you have so many buildings in your area, in your opponent's areas, and even in the neutral area. Really cool. My number 5 city building board game of all time, Lahav. And now we move on to my number 4 city building game of all time, and that is Cuba, designed by Michael Renek and Stefan Stadler and published by Rio Grande Games. And first of all, besides the fact that my wife is actually a natively born person from Cuba, she was born and raised in Cuba for the first few years of her life. Besides that, this game here has a beautiful, gorgeous board by renowned board game artist Michael Menzel. Gorgeous artwork, really catches your attention. And this game here features lots of tropes that you find in Puerto Rico. You have the variable phase order through card play, except unlike Puerto Rico, where you have this neutral communal group of roles that players pick. Each player has a hand of the same exact 5 roles, but not each player is going to play them each in the same order each round. And also, you can only play 4 each round, and not all 5. So each player may not choose the same 5. So everybody's turn, everybody's round is going to look drastically different because they're not necessarily going to play the same cards, and they're not necessarily going to play them in the same order. But the cool thing about this game is the city building. There's so many different buildings that a player can add to their particular hacienda board. And your hacienda board starts kind of like a farmland with a bunch of natural resources that you produce. But as the game progresses, you're making the tough decision of acquiring these city buildings. They're going to be very helpful to you. They're going to grant you victory points at the end of the game, and throughout the game, they're going to grant you lots of really cool actions and benefits. But you got to make the tough decision once you buy one of those city building cards, those building cards, to plot it on one of these spots on your hacienda grid, therefore covering up one of your resources that you were producing from the beginning of the game. And as the game goes on, you're going to have to make that tough decision and basically say, you know what, I'm going to give up the sugar, I'm going to give up the citrus, and I'll produce a little bit less of it, or maybe none of it at all going forward, because it's worth it to get that building. And you got to manipulate this hacienda with your worker piece there so intricately, because wherever you place your worker, every spot that intersects on the column and row of where that worker was placed, every single one of those spots will be triggered, whether you're reaping resources or whether you're triggering building actions. So you want to really calculate where you place your buildings and where you place your worker going forward in order to activate and trigger as many things as efficiently as possible. But again, the city building, there's so many different options and so many different types of things that these building cards could, building tiles can do for you. So again, the city building in this game is probably even higher than some of the games that are higher on this list as far as how relevant those tiles are to you. But since I ranked this list based on how much I like the games, it's going to fall on number 4, which is not too shabby at all. My number 4 city building game of all time, Cuba. And now we move on to my number 3. My number 3 city building game of all time is the Lords of Waterdeep. And this here is a D&D, Dungeons & Dragons themed Euro game. You heard me right. Worker placement game. And it's so cool because, first of all, players are taking on the role of different lords, the different lords of Waterdeep. The players don't actually take on the role of adventurers or heroes. They are the Lords of Waterdeep. And they're manipulating their workers, as a worker placement game, which are referred to as their agents. And even their workers are not the adventurers, but it's the agents who are going throughout the city to the different spots, the worker placement spots, and recruiting adventurers who are going to help you accomplish different quests. quests that will ultimately serve your purposes as a lord. And basically the game starts with a bunch of basic building spots that players can go to get different actions. But as the game progresses, one of the things they could do is that they can build buildings. They have to pay the price, the value, the coin value in order to do so. And then they place it on one of the available open slots around the board. And now that place is an additional worker placement spots for all players. But the player who built that building is going to place one of their ownership tokens on it, therefore designating it as one of their buildings, so that every time a player goes onto one of those buildings that they own, they're going to get a specific bonus for that. So yes, the player will be able to grant whatever action they did, but they're going to be helping the player or the owner of that building, because there's always a little bit of a reward when someone uses your building. Really, really cool. I like that aspect of it. The fact that your city, you're building it and you're getting rewards for them being part of you. So even though they're communally available to all the other players around the table, there is some benefit to you being the person who actually built that building. And all the different buildings grant you different abilities, different actions. Namely, they're helping you gain these different colored resources, which represent your rogues and your fighters and your wizards and your clerics, which are the different types of adventurers that you're trying to recruit in order to go on particular quests. And each of the quests are associated with a different class or a different guild. And based on your lords that you draw at the beginning of the game secretly, you'll be benefited by particular guilds and their type of quest. But also, thematically speaking, depending on the nature of the quest, it will determine what resource cubes representing the adventurers you will require and what configuration of them you'll need. For perhaps for some really difficult quests, you might need 10 cubes, 3 of one color, 3 of another color, and 4 of another. Sometimes you need to combine gold or money with those cubes in order to accomplish these different quests. And there's so many different types of quests that vary in range in their cubes and in the victory point output that they'll grant the player who's able to complete them. And again, at the end of the game, you will get a bonus, a reward for every quest in your completed pile that matches the guild or the class associated with your hidden secret lord. Some really cool things going on in this game, including the worker placement. My number 3 city building game of all time, Lords of Waterdeep. And now we move on to my number 2. And my number 2 city building game of all time is Carson City, designed by Javier Georget. And this here, first of all, it's relatively new to me, and it's another Wild West themed game. So I had another one earlier with Deadwood, and it's another worker placement game. It seems that the worker placement mechanism lends itself to this combination with city building as an additional complementary mechanism, because so many of the games on my list today, not all of them, but a good amount of them, are worker placement games. And in this game, there is no back to show here, so maybe I'll show some images. In this game here, players each have a particular amount of cowboys, which represent their workers, for each round. This game only has 4 rounds. And what's interesting is every worker you use is not returned to your pool at the end of the turn. They're simply discarded and temporarily removed from your possession. However, at the beginning of each round, you're going to draw an additional amount of workers, cowboys, according to the round. So as the game progresses, you're going to have 4 cowboys for round 2, 5 cowboys for rounds 3 and 4 respectively. And what's really cool is that you can save some of those workers. You don't have to use all your workers in the game. You could choose to pass, save some of those workers from that current round, add them to the total of incoming workers that you have coming up for the next round, and therefore maybe have a really powerful round in future turns. Now, also a benefit from passing is that if you're the first player to pass, then you're going to be first in turn order for the next round. And that's really crucial because the turn order allows you to draft these special character cards that not only determine your order for the execution of your actions during your worker placement phase of a round, But each of these different characters grant you a different benefit, a different bonus action or benefit that you're going to get for that current round. So it's really beneficial and advantageous for you as a player to try to get that first place whenever you can. Also, any unused workers, not only do they carry over to the next round, but they serve to add to your strength, your power. As a player, you're going to be engaging in dueling, in conflicts, just like in Deadwood that I mentioned earlier. If players go to the same spot, they're going to duel for it. And when they're measuring up their power, first of all, they're going to factor in a die roll that's going to take place, but they're going to add to that die roll whatever their strength is. And their strength is based on a resource, which is referred to as your power, which is a wooden piece reflecting a revolver. But on top of it all, any unused workers for that current round, when you engage in that combat, are going to be added to your power or your strength, therefore increasing your chances of winning these duels. And there's so many cool things going. You're trying to gain possession of particular parcels or sections of the board, which the board consists of a grid of 8 by 8, I believe it is, spaces. So you're talking about 64 different spaces, and you're trying to get particular spots in your ownership. And not all spots are created equal. Some are very valuable because they have houses adjacent to them, or they have nearby mountains, or they have other buildings that help them or make them more valuable. Really, really cool. And you're triggering all these worker placement spot actions in turn order, but you're also, one of the things you're doing is you're acquiring these new buildings as a player, and you're placing them on parcels or parts of the board that you're already in control of. And these buildings are going to grant you money, which ultimately will lead to your victory points later on in the game. But they're also going to grant you specific actions. Sometimes they're going to get you more revolver tokens, more power, or sometimes they're going to prevent duels from any area that's adjacent to it. Sometimes they will give you additional benefits like representing multiple houses. So there's all these different things that these buildings do, and combining them and mixing and matching them, and their placement, their actual spatial orientation on the board actually matters, which is what makes Carson City different from a lot of these other games. A lot of these other games, where you place the buildings did not necessarily matter. Cuba is probably the only other game where the spatial element actually matters, but not nearly as much as in Carson City, because based on where you place those buildings, that's going to determine how valuable those buildings are for you and what they can or cannot do for you. My number 2 city building game of all time, Carson City. And now we move on to my number 1. And I don't know why, folks, but this is still my number 1, and that's Kingsburg. And this game here, designed by Andrea Charvesio and Luca Yannaco. This game here, this reprint by Z-Man Games. It's a worker placement game, again, dice placement, and it has a fantasy theme. The worker placement spots represent the royal court, all the way down from the court jester, all the way up to the king and everything in between. And these all have different values assigned to them, which are basically the pip values that you need to have on your dice when you place them on these spots. And they all grant you different abilities or benefits. Mostly it's resource gathering. You're gathering gold, you're gathering stone, and you're gathering wood. And these are the resources you're going to need in order to build your buildings. And each player has a grid, a 4x4 grid of different buildings, or a 6x4 grid, depending on if you're playing with one of the expansion modules from the To Forge a Realm expansion. So you got 4x4 or 6x4, which that's how I play with the 6x4. It gives you additional buildings. So that's 6 times 4. That's 24 different buildings you could build. Here's the thing. They're divided into 6 different rows and 4 different columns. And whenever you build a city on a particular row, not only do you need to meet its requirement as far as the resources are concerned, but you need to build in order from left to right. So if you really want a building that's on the 3rd column, you're going to have to build all the other buildings to its left on the same row. So sometimes you might build buildings that you might not be too interested in, but it's all part of the process to work your way towards that particular building that you're coveting. And I find that to be really cool. I like the worker placement. I like the fantastical setting, although it's very abstracted. Basically represented through the card that's flipped at the end of the winter phase of each round or each year, that determines which horde of fantastical monsters and creatures are going to be attacking your section of Kingsburg, and whether or not you're going to be able to defend it. But beyond that, the city building aspect is absolutely my favorite part of this game. I love, and talking about Carson City where the spatial orientation is relevant, that's the case here in a different way. All the buildings are static. They're always in the same spot within that 6x4 grid, but you, each game, get to choose where do you want to go and what order do you want to go into. And it's so neat because there's so many cool different things that a lot of these buildings do for you. Some of them are a little bit more nuanced and subtle. Perhaps you won't be able to catch it at first glance how they could benefit you. And others are just straight up obvious. They're going to give you tons of victory points at the end of the game, therefore contributing to your victory. Really cool. My number one city building game of all time, Kingsburg. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here when Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below and tell me what's your favorite city building game. Which of my games are you absolutely surprised at the fact that it's on my list at all, or perhaps where it ranked on this list. That's it for today, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.